HDR, so there's a difference. There's bracketing. I talked about in my Photoshop Lightroom for Landscape Photographers class yesterday, where I bracket everything. And that's just to make sure I capture all the highlights and shadows, just to cover myself in case I need to add or merge a layer, but more just to make sure I capture it. Then there's HDR, which to me is more of a different art form. It's more of a painterly effect. You know, I wouldn't use it for my outdoor photos because I don't really care for the way it looks. But it's got an effect to it. It's got a grungy type of surreal, works great for indoors, city lights, things like that. So this is St. Patrick's Cathedral. Works great for something like this, to really bring out all the tones and everything. It will almost make it look like a painting. But we'll select all 3 photos, photo, edit in, merge to HDR in Photoshop. And it's gonna jump over to Photoshop and it's gonna use its HDR dialog box. So it opens up with a whole new set of settings inside of it. This one needed the raw file, so it's gonna take a minute. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves. There we go. That wasn't too bad. So it merges everything together. Easy thing to do here is if you wanna use Photoshop's HDR, take this from 32-bit to 16, because it opens up all these settings for you down here. So what kinds of things would we want to do? Gamma, think of gamma as like the flattening tool. So gamma will make everything flat. It'll kind of remove all contrast for it. Exposure does exactly what you think, bumps up the exposure. Detail is going to start adding that grit to the photo. Radius and strength. As I increase my strength, you'll see it starts to pull out some of the contrast in there. And then radius, you're not even gonna really see the radius until you bump up the strength. But radius is gonna give it a little bit of that glow. So I'm not gonna go quite that high. I'm kind of just moving everything around to show you. Shadows, highlights, vibrance, saturation. These are all things we have inside of Lightroom. So we'll end up back in Lightroom. That's where if I wanted to do anything, I'd finish up that stuff. Kind of push that a little bit. Play with the gamma. All right. So we don't have to worry about it here. If you had something moving through the photo, like if there was a car going through the photo or something like that, there's an option to remove ghosts. A little bit weird in a church photo. We'll turn it on and see if any ghosts appear. But if you did, like you did a night shot of a city and there's a car going through, it'll attempt to go in there and remove the ghosting that happened from that. So let's click OK. And this will bring us back over into Photoshop in 7 to 10 minutes. There we go. From here, we could do cloning healing. You'll see that there's tiny little things down here, so I could grab my clone stamp tool, Option or Alt click, and just duplicate it. Just move it over a bit. There we go. So I could go in there and clone and get rid of all that stuff. Some other things that we'd probably want to do is fix some of the distortion. I think we can do that inside of Lightroom, so I'm just going to go to File, Save. And this is going to bring us right back over to Lightroom. And we'll go down to the Lens Corrections panel. There's the upright section, Auto, not so good. Level, nothing. Vertical, horrible. Full, even worse. From there, we'll go to Manual. And so now we can rotate that around a little bit. I know if there's an architectural photographer out there, you're screaming over the lines that are moving. Again, as an architectural photographer and your clients, that's important. The rest of the world doesn't care. Okay, so if you're an architectural photographer, yes, you have to go in there and you got to start going to your vertical perspective and doing all that stuff. You probably used a tilt shift lens and different things to help avoid those things. But the rest of the world who's used to taking their iPhone and taking a shot like that is used to those lines, so I don't go crazy fixing them. So we can go in there and, again, maybe rotate just a little bit. There we go. And then I can finish it off, maybe a couple, little bit of a vignette. Some sharpening. Lots of sharpening on HDR photos. A little bit of whites. Adjust your white balance. But that's our final image. More kind of goes along that painterly type of a look. It's got to have the right photo for an HDR, and that's what's important about it, though. Okay. Yes, sir.
Where do we draw the line between the bracketed photo and the HDR? Because typically when we see a photo like that, people just assume it's automatically HDR.
Yeah. Where do we draw the line? I get, are you saying how much is too much, or?
Yeah, in the difference. In the difference between the two.
Yeah. HDR has become more of an effect. All right, that's really what it's become. It used to be a tool to merge your highlights and your shadows, and sometimes a lot of architectural photographers still use it. But aside from the need for it, where I can't capture my shadows and I can't capture my highlights and I need that to merge the photos together, aside from that, to me, HDR is more of an effect these days. And so people look at, is that an HDR? And even if I didn't combine it, yeah, it's got the HDR effect on it. All right, and so that to me is where it's drawn. Is when people think of HDR today, they're not thinking of, I want my shadows and highlights to balance. They're thinking of, that looks like an HDR. So, in fact, I was going to show you guys if you go, I'll go down here to plug-in extras. Perfect Effects from On1 has an HDR section in it, and you'll see a lot of people are actually just converting their photos to HDR just for the effect. It's not actually to get the shadows and highlights. So, but when you go over to the HDR look, I'll go to Surreal, and you can already see it's starting to get that effect to it. If I add a layer to it and I go to dynamic contrast, because a lot of this stuff is contrast, I'll go down here to dynamic contrast, maybe even go to Surreal on that. There we go. Let's make it look horrible. And then, of course, who doesn't need a vignette to finish things off? There we go. But that's before, that's after. You can save that as a preset in here. I just go to the preset menu and save it. And you have instant HDR effect. That to me is what HDR has become. HDR has become more of a stylizing than it is for the need of HDR. Okay, so we got our HDR. And for those of you that were here yesterday, you saw me replace the sky, but that's one of the things that we still need Photoshop for if I wanted to replace the sky. Where's my morally opposed? She's not here today. I made a joke. I was like, anybody morally opposed to doing this? She's like me. She's very nice. We talked about it later. But sky replacements, I got the same error yesterday. Photo edit in and open as layers in Photoshop. I'll preface this by saying the same thing I said during my landscape photographer's class yesterday, which is you need the right photos. All right? It's got to be a photo that lends itself to replacing the sky. If this were taken on an overcast day, and I wanted to throw this sky in there, there's no trick in the world that's going to make it work for you. Okay, it's got to be photos that lend themselves to it. I'm going to flip it just to put my sky on top, and we'll just take our quick selection tool, make a real quick selection of the sky, go to Refine Edge. The reason why I'm using Refine Edge is just right over here. On the trees. So, in case you missed, that's the selection that we went in there with. And that's what just that quick brush stroke did. So pretty amazing stuff. We'll click OK. So we've got our selection. I'll go up to my sky layer, and going back to our layer mask basics, if we have something selected, when I click the layer mask, whatever's selected stays. So that stays. All right. If I go to the move tool and I try to move the sky, you'll see that it moves the layer mask with it, which is not what we want. And that's only because we are linked to the layer mask. So if I turn that link off, now I can take the move tool and move it into place, and then also resize a little bit, reduce the opacity. But the reason why it works is because that sky has the sun going down over here, and the original photo has the sun going down over there. So those are things that you want to look for. When you can match those things up, if you're not morally opposed to it, you can match those things up, and you can actually replace the sky pretty seamlessly without anyone being able to tell. But it's when the lighting's totally different, it's an overcast day, and you're trying to take a bright colored sky, there's so much more to a scene than just the sky. It's all that light that it casts, and it's usually more work than I'd ever want to do to try to replace a sky. I try to just go back to the location. Which I was telling my story yesterday. This is the Big Sur coastline, and it took me like 5 years to get this shot. I was literally here 4 or 5 times in 5 years. Every time I walked up, it's fog. Fog, fog, fog. I'd be driving, it'd be clear, and I'd get it. I'd enter the Big Sur and it'd fog. So, and all my friends would tell me, oh, you got to come in this month. Okay, I'd go in that month. Fog. It was always that way.